it's been a long time since I've done anything not about gaming on video, but with the election here, I feel like I have to at least bring out a certain something. And no, I'm not going to try to convince you of, some partisan decision making for this presidential election or whatever. I think both parties have gone to hell here. I have my own. I'd rather it be my flavor of failure than your flavor of failure, but I can't really convince anybody one side's right or the other because they're both so disturbing. What I'm coming to you about is the Electoral College. A lot of people really hate the Electoral College, and I can understand that. It gets in the way of this direct voting concept, right? Direct voting was plausible back around the turn of the 20th century, 19th to 20th century. The reason was most voting districts that were rural, at least, most people knew other people in the area. Even urban districts there was more of a sense of community. So you had some definite fraud, however, even there, in any electoral situation. As we've gone, though, it's gotten worse and worse. We don't have the processing power to have, now there's exceptions. I'm going to say Oregon actually, I think, did a pretty good job with their handling of mail-in ballots, and that may actually be the only answer, is to process mail-in ballots. Because when you're starting to talk about processing people through enough individual locations, you start seeing these humongous lines building up. Even in early voting, you're seeing people waiting 6-7 hours out there. That's just crazy, man. That's crazy. It used to be voting, I can remember going on election day, not all that long ago, and you were processed immediately. You had maybe a 15-20 minute wait. It should not ever be along the lines of the kind of circumstances that face you at, say, a DMV. Whether or not this indirect affects certain population, certain demographics more or less than others, let's put that aside because that may be the case, but it doesn't matter whether or not it is. No one should be going through that, okay? All right. So once we get that, well, where is the problem really? To a large extent, the problem is that we're requiring everyone to go vote, or allowing everyone to go vote, as it were. So now there's issues with, say, we need voter identification. That's going to slow this whole process down if you're going to start checking IDs significantly. But there's this bugaboo of possible voter fraud, which has always existed. There's no question there. And the biggest fraud has always been the fraud at, and I can assure you of this from personal experience, the fraud at the actual election sites and within the commissions. I'm not saying everyone is, but you know what? They're there to win their election. They're partisan. There's one person from each party. They're going to damn sure make certain that a third party candidate is going to have trouble if they can. Not everyone, but some of them are going to be corrupt because maybe their job relies on them making certain that their party at least places second. Now, they'd love for their party to place first because maybe these political animals can get a job that way. That's the built-in issue, and there's no way around that. You're going to have that kind of local election fraud no matter what. That's why we have the bipartisan system of election commissioners. One is going to watch the other. It's also why we have a two-party system in part because, well, we've locked that in. The top two parties get the election commissioners and they're watching each other, but they don't mind if a bunch of, Libertarian or Green Party votes get disqualified if need be, right? Okay. And I don't think there's a way around that. Not with anything like our situation. There may be ways of maybe performing a truly impartial voting analysis or whatever. So let's start looking at what our modern innovations to fix all this are. Well, one of the biggest ones is that we're going to these electronic voting machines. They process people more quickly, perhaps. I'm not sure if they're really more quick, more speedy than those old New York State and elsewhere. I think they were invented in 1919, the big voting booth where you pull the lever and it records all your votes. And that's what I'm used to, and those seem to work fine. And I didn't understand why, back in 2000 election, why Florida had so much trouble with these butterfly ballots. We never had a problem with the old machines. They worked, and in fact, they did a study around that election and showed that they were actually one of the best methods still out there when they were trying to look at the electronic voting. But the problem with the electronic voting machines, and you could say the same about these mechanical ones, except the mechanics is very easy to look at. The electronic voting machines have complicated software. And it's very, very possible to put anything you like in complicated enough software, and it likely will not be seen, even by a code review. If you're trying to commit fraud directly, if that's your goal as, say, the owner of the company, I think there's a Romney that owns one of these big companies, right? And before we had the Diebold owner promising the election to George W. Bush, it doesn't matter whose hands they're in. If they're in the hands of a political person, a single political person, they're going to have some influence over this. It's not going to be a clear-cut case. Whatever election is determined by them is always going to be under a shadow if the mechanical tool is not obvious to anyone that it's absolutely secure. Now, I don't know if those old 1919 machines could be tricked or jimmied, but they went through many, many, many decades without changes, without anybody really pointing to any possibility of fraud in them. To me, that's probably a reasonable amount of assurance. They're a mechanical device. We haven't had great mechanical technique that allow you to disrupt these things, electrical things. You can always kind of disrupt electrical systems, right? At worst, you can do an EMP near them and knock them out. But here's the thing. So we have a fair assumption that those mechanical tools were fairly secure. Of course, the election commissioners and people working in the districts can still drop a box of votes somewhere and lose it. Same effect with the paper ballots. Paper ballots have a real problem because they tend to get disqualified for a stray mark or something like that. The machine gives you an accurately selected ballot each time, is sort of the idea there. But there's still opportunities for misplacing a bunch of ballots or a machine for a few weeks, you know, and that may be enough. But what does this all come to? Well, it comes to the fact that apparently those mechanical machines are insufficient nowadays. We need something faster, better, able to transmit stuff more. Okay, so we rely on these electronic ballot machines in many places, scanners even. And the problem with anything electronic, as I've said, the software can be fudged. It's possible even for the underlying software to be fudged. But if you're allowing people to go in and change that software to be able to read specific numbers of entries or something, then you've got a real issue there. If you've got some kind of central collating location that'll count and tabulate all the votes, you've got an issue. And essentially, direct voting has made it so that the states have to conduct this massive vote effort that is subject to corruption. Now, it strikes me as better to just somewhat admit that the machines control who's going to move forward. that what was initially intended, which was the state legislatures, let them be elected however the states choose. If they choose to build a certain kind of corruption in, or a different kind, that's up to them. But however they choose to be determined themselves and to determine their own vote, it would make sense to just forward their decision. There wouldn't be these recounts. You know why? Because you'd have 100, 200 people, whatever, sitting in a room, all of whom can vocally announce who they're voting for openly, if they choose. I mean, obviously this is up to the legislature, but it's very clear. And these are people who have a vested interest, if their vote is going to be recorded who they're selecting, in selecting those people, in selecting the electors, as it were, who will represent the will of their constituencies. Yes, it's indirect, but we trust all sorts of indirection. And I think it would clean up a lot of our electoral situations if we weren't trying to pressure the electorate as a whole, millions and millions of uninformed people on sound bites, whom they should vote for. It would still be an issue, there's no question. There would still be partisan conflicts, but it would no longer fall back on this sort of lowest common denominator that we've fallen to in this electoral cycle, where what are we coming down to because of the split electorate and the location? Well, we're looking for, in maybe 9 swing states, the 3 or 4% of people who have been too unaware to make up their mind what and who they think is going to be a better steward for this country. Personally, I'd much rather see the state legislature get together, maybe cut a deal, or, if not that, at least, have a rational discussion about it and come down to a vote. It may be straight across party lines, that's fine. No problem there. It would probably reflect a very, very similar electoral map to what we have in here. But it might get rid of some of the rancor. And it certainly would bring issues that are important to the individual states, and thus to their constituents, to the fore, rather than worrying about these, so-and-so is going to ruin the country, or so-and-so is going to just take us in totally the wrong direction, or they're illegitimate, or whatever. That would just be gone. That wouldn't be a real factor in politics. And, it's kind of funny because nobody much seems, they praise our founding fathers, the hemp-smoking lot of them, well, at least the Virginians that we most respect, right? But they're willing to have thrown this away, which was this check between the mass rule, which I think they rather cleverly tried to disassociate our governance from. And now we're paying the price for it. There may have been times in our history when this popular election worked fairly well, but I think we're seeing that it's working very, very poorly. And then people start blaming the Electoral College itself for something like 2000, where, yes, one person got the popular, one person got the electoral. Big deal. You're still winning by this tiny amount. I think what's important is to really express what the states think in these elections, who they forward. And by the way, I'd say the same thing with senators, too. Let the states decide how they want to elect senators. Quite a few states had already decided, we're going to forward the, we're going to allow the people just to vote for them. That's great. Let them. And then the state representatives rubber stamp it and say, yeah, it's good. That's fine. But it should be left up to the states. And I think we made a really, really terrible wrong turn when we decided to link this federal government and essentially take away what had been a very, very well-reasoned initial design. Anyway, that's my thoughts on it.